Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. International world leaders make alliances with each other to either prevent war or from stopping dictators and despots from committing genocide, or at times unjustifiably even pressurizing countries to toe the line. Essentially today what we will be talking about on Newswire with our guest is what role do alliances across the world play in the current circumstances, also in the historical context, in terms of regions where there is conflict or where conflict is about to erupt. So let me, without further ado, introduce our guests who are joining us today. From London, we are joined by Mr. Nicolai Due Gundersen, a political analyst and also the author of Privatization of Warfare. Also with us from Sydney is international relations expert Dr. Nina Markovic. Thank you so much to both of you for taking out the time and speaking to us here on a Newswire. I want to start with you, Mr. Gundersen. You're also working on a PhD thesis which essentially focuses on the legitimacy of Arab governments during the Arab Spring and also non-democratic political legitimacy. In your words, and I want to quote you here from earlier this year, you said, returning to a dictatorship is not a good idea. People only focus on stability that they remember during a dictatorship, but do not remember the suppression itself. If we talk about the Arab Spring, there is that factor of our conversation over alliances that talks about the perpetuating movement that created that sort of domino-like effect amongst Middle East and North African countries. And then there is the factor that helps stop it. What role did regional international powers play in both aspects?
So going back to the idea of stability versus moving on from the Arab Spring, obviously stability is one of the key elements that many and others have sold to their own people, to the United States and to various allies, and we still see this happening today. I think that the Arab Spring is not fully over for this reason, perhaps it's even failed, because stability is often the main selling point. And there are countries such as Jordan and others where they actually focus on selling stability as the main reason for staying in power. In order to sell such stability, of course, you need alliances, and many dictatorships, many republicans and also monarchies in the Gulf have an alliance with Washington. That may be changing, as we've seen with what's happening in Iran and the Gulf. But yes, stability is still a key selling point. And the problem here is that selling stability also allows governments to prevent the formation of democratic institutions, because they argue that, we are protecting the people, we provide security, that is more important than democracy. That has been the main line in response to the Arab Spring by many governments across the Arab world.
So, Dr. Nina, bringing this conversation to you, do you agree with stability being the strongest selling point here? But if we are to refer to the example of Iran also here, US-Iran tensions, do you feel that there is a kind of shift taking place in light of how US has a very strong role to play in building these alliances?
Definitely. I mean, look at what happened on Wednesday in Sydney. Australia had its annual meeting with the United States, and Australia was actually invited to participate in a coalition to monitor Iran's movements in international waters. Now, Australia has a very strong and long-lasting alliance with the United States. Now, we're talking about the shift from pure alliances to coalitions, sort of coalitions of the willing, that Iraq war sort of stigma is always there. When it comes to Iran, definitely tensions are on the rise, and coalition of the willing, so to speak, beyond and above alliances is what seems to be happening right now.
And what is, if you could spell out for us, who is involved in this coalition of the willing?
Well, Australia has not provided an answer yet. The idea is to protect international shipping. If you look at the wording of the US Defense Secretary, the wording is quite strong. Australia has been quite neutral so far in the language, but not giving a response yet means Australia is considering this possibility. What can happen? Let's say Australia does participate in this coalition of the willing. What if an Australian ship is attacked? Is that an act of war against Australia? Australia has this ANZUS alliance with the United States, which is not automatic defense like in the NATO case, but pretty close to it. Vice versa, if an American ship gets attacked and Australia is present in the region, does that mean also declaration of war against Australia? That's why there is no clear answer as yet, but it is likely that Australia will participate in some shape or form in this coalition.
Okay, so Mr. Gundersen, let me again come to the same question here, especially in terms of what we're seeing with US-Iran tensions and the question of protecting international shipping routes. We've seen Germany opt out, we've seen the UK jump in, but here, of course, incentive is always a major factor besides stability. What's at stake for the country getting involved? The UK is poised to leave the European Union. Brexit is looming large. It's sucking up most of their attention away from what is probably needed with more priority on foreign policy. Do you feel like this shift that we're seeing with long-term allies such as Germany, with the Washington, D.C., this is something that might pick up as a trend across the board?
Without a doubt. I mean, going back to Brexit and what's been happening with the United Kingdom, there is the issue of to what extent will Boris Johnson and the UK get involved with Trump's plans in Iran to get access to trade deals. That's one thing. Recently, I mean, literally a few hours ago, the UK announced that it was pulling some of its guards from the Strait of Hormuz, so those of UK nationality, because of the tanker seizures. Now, that shows that they are taking Iran's threats seriously, but at the same time, they still want to be involved in some sort of coalition. So we're talking about possibly, an EU coalition, maybe a US-led coalition as well, to protect the strait. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about shipping routes. We're talking very importantly about oil routes. I think that's another thing to remember. The Gulf is a hub for energy, and the West and others, we need access to that energy. We can't live without it. So I think that that's a major incentive for the formation of these coalitions. And let's also remember that I think that mutual cooperation is really what is at the core of such alliances. The moment that there's no need for the moment we don't have mutual interest, these alliances may begin to shatter. So, for example, when we had the blockade against Qatar back in 2017, some argue that it showed that the Gulf Cooperation Council no longer had a mutual alliance. They didn't have mutual interests, and so the whole coalition is crumbling. If it was a stronger coalition, if it was a stronger council as before, perhaps they could do what they were meant to do, which is to basically block Iran. And we don't see that happening right now. We see the UK getting a bit more involved, the US getting a bit more involved, and Oman struggling to facilitate. That's what it used to do up until recently, but now we see that Iran is becoming very, very tense.
It's becoming very tense. It's reaching out to regional. Do you feel that there's a kind of significant change in alliance taking place in terms of what is happening with Jordan, moving closer towards Qatar? And what could this essentially mean right now in the Middle East?
Yes, this is a very interesting example because Jordan is it has been a U.S. ally. It's reliant on external aid to survive. And up until recently, it was Saudi Arabia that provided a lot of the regional aid with, of course, certain strings possibly attached. Now, we had protests last year at a time when Gulf aid was not renewed to the extent that Jordan was expecting. And I do believe this is the main reason they're turning to Qatar. Qatar is a small country with a lot of gas, a lot of wealth, and a lot of soft power. And Jordan knows this.
Moving on, the point I was trying to get to with is that when there's also an incentive of foreign aid, if we go back in history, we saw in World War II how this played out when Germany and Italy and Japan fought against the US. But when the war came to an end and Europe was facing famine, the US stepped in. It wasn't really for a charity cause, was it?
No, I mean, obviously, one of the things that the U.S. wanted to do was to ensure that Europe remained under its sphere of influence. And of course, one of the things that would scare the United States at the time was that communist or the Soviet Russian state was also a victor. Let's not forget that. And of course, what happened was after the Second World War, after Potsdam, suddenly the U.S. sees all these Eastern European states falling to communist influence. That idea of a domino effect was quite scary for the U.S. administration, and it certainly explains why they got involved with aid and also in some cases with war, for example, Vietnam. We could also see the same happening right now. We could actually map out the GCC and the Gulf in terms of spheres of influence. So, who is helping Iran? Who is involved in Syria, who's going to who. These alliances are politically motivated and economically motivated. But yes, it's also about spheres of influence.
Energy is a key role here. The U.S. is also interested in not just the Mediterranean seas. It's got its ally there in Israel. Could you spell out for us a little of their loyalties to Israel also when it comes to the threat of Russian dominance in the energy sector in Europe?
Well, certainly Israel has always been a U.S. ally for a variety of reasons, in part because some argue that they need U.S. support to be a player in the region. At the same time, they do they deny having nuclear capabilities, but many argue that they do have it, and they have their own defense systems much stronger than some of the Arab states. So they are seen as a vital linchpin for U.S. interests because of that. At the same time, in terms of Russia, I find it very interesting that Russia has gotten involved in Syria to the extent that it has. It's also gotten more involved in Africa. Russia wants to maintain energy access as well. It has its own oil fields, but it also wants to ensure that the Middle East can become a transit hub for further markets. Russia and the Gulf, one thing they have in common is they're also looking towards Asia as a major energy market. We see recently, over the past few years, many Gulf monarchies have visited Moscow. And at the same time, Russia has reciprocated by signing various trade deals. There's even recently been talk of a nuclear deal with Kuwait, between Kuwait and Russia. Now, Kuwait is a U.S. ally, so I'm sure that should such a deal be cemented, it would scare the U.S. But again, this is all about coming back to influence. Russia does not want to be left behind. Russia wants to be a major player in the Middle East as well. It's not just the U.S., and perhaps some argue that this is a second Cold War.
All right, thank you so much. Very great points, Dr. Nicolai Due Gundersen. Coming back to you, Dr. Nina, if we are to look at it sort of from a bird's eye view, could we say fairly or accurately that at the end of the day, it all stems from who has most influence in terms of sources of energy?
Definitely the sources of energy matter. But the protection of those sources matter even more. This is particularly the case with countries which don't have strong defenses, and this is in particular why weaker countries enter alliances. So alliances can be entered for offensive reasons, for defensive reasons, and for security reasons. It's almost like a prearranged marriage. Sometimes these marriages are done to secure physical spaces, such as energy security, really. But at other times, it is a short-term security. If you look at a historical example, for example, in the late 19th century, a series of alliances have actually led to a series of wars. So in 1877, for example, there was a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, a very devastating war, hundreds of thousands of people dead. However, the Great Britain had the alliance with the Ottoman Empire. Thanks to the British actually support of the Ottoman Empire, this empire did not collapse. Now, had the UK not supported the Ottoman Empire, Russia would have won and it would have taken over Constantinople. So World War I would have looked very different. Therefore, access to resources is crucial, not just the actual physical acquisition of them and presence. As we know, borders change as well. Borders are not static. This is why alliances are quite important.
Alliances are important in that sense also, but like you mentioned, it's like an arranged marriage. A lot of things change along the way. There are a lot of expectations that aren't met. And also the dynamics, the incentives vary. Now, to kind of counter this kind of falling out between alliances, the conflict management part of it should also have some kind of safeguard, like an international organization that could oversee and help resolve conflicts between allies. We have the UN and other groups like the African Union, the European Union, but the role they play, do you feel like in the current world, is it effective at all? Is it playing the same role that they were sort of born to do or made to do?
Well, especially with the Trump administration, multilateralism has been weakened. A lot of U.S. governments, which are not multilateralist in nature, tend to weaken international institutions. But your example was interesting. We can relate to NATO, for example. We had a bit of a rift between the United States and Turkey, which is a NATO member. Actually, since 1955, we had 50 NATO members, including Turkey, to counteract the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union at the time. Now, if there is a conflict within an alliance, there should be institutional mechanisms within that organization to deal with conflicts. Now, this is not always the case, as we know from the African Union, for example. When you talk about the United Nations level, it is very difficult, as we know, to enforce a lot of the rules that the United Nations stands for. For example, in 1999, NATO led its first sort of out-of-area offensive military operation against Yugoslavia. That was not authorized by the Security Council. That was not a multilateral decision. Actually, not all NATO members supported this action, only 19. Therefore, there was a conflict within NATO as to how to approach this operation. It was offensive, not defensive in nature. But then we had the rise of the humanitarian concept of humanitarian so-called intervention. As we know, what happened later on in 2003, coalition of the willing against Iraq, some people were invoking humanitarian intervention concepts as well. But we know that that was far from truth when this conflict was over and the consequences of which we can still feel. When it comes to Iraq war, what was interesting is that two allies did not agree. Germany and France. Those were close allies of the United States in previous wars, but not in that war. And that caused quite a bit of fallout within bilateral relationships, but also in the multilateral setting. So when we look at the alliances, really should be contextualizing them, not looking at them in a sort of generalized way, because different situations warrant different approaches.
So every situation is unique. Thank you so much, Dr. Nina. Here I'd like to introduce another guest who's just joining us from Moscow, Mr. Tim Kirby, joining us from Moscow, political analyst for strategic culture. Mr. Kirby, talking about this very example of how allies themselves could come into conflict while sort of cheering in another issue, another conflict zone. We've seen what has been happening between the US and Turkey. They have been long-term alliances through NATO. And yet at the same time, would you say that Turkey has used its role over the S-400 conflict and how it was pressurizing to attack northeast Syria, almost like a leverage against sort of pushing the US in a corner?
Well, before we talk about Turkey, I'd like to mention a particular quote by Alexander III, Tsar of Russia, is that Russia's only allies are its army and its navy. And in reality, that's the way the world works, because we can make all the agreements we want on paper or with handshakes, but in a lot of ways they don't matter. So right now, Turkey is being a very good NATO partner and wanting to try to create that 30-kilometer deep border zone within the territory of Syria, which is all nice for NATO, but then, yes, a couple weeks ago, it was buying S-400 systems from Russia. The explanation of that is Turkey wants to pursue its own policy, and it's strong enough to do that. One of the important things to understand when we're talking about alliances is it's a power dynamic. You can't have an alliance between an extremely strong force and an extremely weak force. You can only have alliances between, relatively speaking, equal forces. Otherwise, you have a lord and vassal situation, which you see right after World War II, where they destroyed Europe. The United States entered to the west, the Soviet Union entered to the east, created NATO, and then the Warsaw Pact, which weren't really alliances, but more of a lord-vassal division of Europe.
And taking advantage of that, we're seeing what is unfolding. I mean, the cost of human life, isn't it directly then dependent on how these world leaders, how these alliances decide to move forward, looking after only their own vested interests?
The problem is when we look at something from a very human perspective, we forget that it's a very different perspective when you're the leader of a country. Every decision that any leader can make could have a positive or negative effect. Any minor change in the economy could cause 100 people here to gain jobs, 10 people there to lose jobs, and it goes back to the logic of sometimes you have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. I think that that's the problem. There's really no way to avoid certain things, especially since throughout the entire history of humanity, there has been war, there's war today, and there will always be war. However, the best we can do is to try to make the proper deals to reduce the amount of war on the planet to the maximum that we can. But unfortunately, completely creating some sort of situation where we all become allies is impossible. The only scenario that would allow that would be some sort of complete and total domination of the world by one force that represses everyone into total submission. As long as there are different opinions, different views, disputed territories, we're always going to have conflicts. But thanks to the fact that we now are living in a situation of mutually assured destruction, things are actually relatively peaceful now compared to, say, 70 years ago. So things aren't so bad.
Well, that's a very optimistic point of view there. But let me sort of offer an option here. I mean, I know we have the UN, we have the African Union, we have the European Union, we have various these kind of organizations. But just talking about the UN Security Council, sort of maybe have a refurbished, rethought out conflict management system where instead of having one power dominating the entire world, we have a more sort of just and cohesive international organization that is essentially neutral in arbitrating and be able to effectively implement its judgment.
UN Security Council is the exact proof why that sort of scenario could never happen. Because who's on the UN Security Council? The sides that won World War II. So World War II ends, Germany is crushed, as with Italy and the other allies, and then they want to make this sort of world government thing arise, right? And who gets to be on the Security Council? All the winners. All the dominating ones who took everything and took the power. So that's exactly it. The only person who's really going to be able to install a sort of global system that dominates everyone else for their benefit, they'll say, would be the world hegemon, which is currently the United States and probably will be into the foreseeable future. But with the problems economically the world is having, and especially the United States, I don't think that that's going to happen. The multipolar world, as it's called, is probably going to come into play, and that will not necessarily guarantee peace, but it'll certainly be much better for the future of humanity as a whole. Sometimes you have to live a little bit dangerously in order to live well.
Okay, stay with us there. Well, let me introduce another guest us from Budapest, a researcher and, of course, Senior Research Fellow of Global Policy Institute, Mr. George Szamuely. Thank you for taking out the time and speaking with us here. We're essentially at the moment debating whether the UN has a problem with the fact that the main 5 members have veto power, and that essentially takes away the very effect the UN should be able to have as an arbitrator or as a sort of bringing justice to conflict zones, resolving conflicts. Is there another option in trying to save this balance of power without having just depending on alliances between countries who have a upper hand economically, financially?
Well, not really, because the UN Security Council is actually quite effective as organization and a measure of what is in accordance with international law and what isn't in accordance with international law. So we know that, let's say, resolutions of the UN Security Council are international law. I mean, we can debate about whether it's entirely in accordance with international law and whether it's entirely in accordance with the UN Charter. But we can, roughly speaking, say that, well, if this is decreed by the UN Security Council, then this becomes binding on other countries. Now, it was unfortunate that very briefly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia disappeared as a world power, and the United States and its junior NATO partners, 2 of whom are also on the UN Security Council, they're permanent members of the UN Security Council, England and France, were able to sweep everybody aside and just ram everything through the UN Security Council without any serious opposition, because China tends to follow Russia. I mean, it's generally China has very rarely sticks its neck out and pursues some kind of an independent cause, other than on its own very narrow interests, which is Hong Kong and Taiwan, but generally on everything else, on international crises, it tends to follow Russia. So that was the problem. So
let's hold that thought, Mr. George. Let me take a quick short break. Mr. Kirby with us also. We'll be right back and resume this conversation. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Coming back to you, Mr. George, we were talking about essentially how China usually, you were saying, follows the Russian sort of stance and what its interests lie in the region in light of how alliances work out in their case.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So just to finish my thought was that during about 10 years ago, Russia reemerged as a great power, and it essentially adopted the position that the USSR held during the Cold War, which is the leader of a global alliance against Western hegemony. So that's what the USSR did during the Cold War. That's just simply vanished suddenly in 1991 for about 15 years. Now it's, what we have is pretty much as it was during the Cold War. You have on the one hand the three permanent members, England, US, France, who are also NATO, and then on the other side you have Russia and China that always follows Russia. So we're now back in this situation, a kind of a stalemate, as it was during the Cold War. But what is important about that is that Security Council, it enables that kind of the opposition, the official global opposition to Western hegemony, to have somebody speak on his behalf. And Russia is the power that speaks on his behalf, and very, very articulately. But that's the importance of the UN Security Council, that Russia is able to speak on behalf of the rest of the world against the West.
Okay, I hear you there. But maybe I'd like to ask if you agree whether this is role that UN plays in whether these highlighting the opposition, as he says it, through Russia against Western hegemony, is that how it's working out? Because if you look at the situation on the map, the conflicts are just getting worse, not better, whether we're talking about what's happening in the Middle East or we're talking even about what is evolving currently in Kashmir.
About getting worse. Well, I don't know. Worse relative to what? I mean, the Soviets lost 15,000 men in Afghanistan. Somewhat that'd be already 30, 40 years ago. But the Battle of Borodino had 500,000 participants in it. You know what I mean? So we shouldn't get into this better or worse thing. That's a bit semantics. Of what the other guest said about Russia's ideology of sort of representing maybe the globally oppressed or downtrodden against the single power of the United States. There is some truth to that, but I would like to also undercut that is an ideological message that certain people in the government believe, but overall, Russia is just trying to survive. If you look at the situation in Ukraine, how Russia took, after the referendum, was able to be allowed to take the Crimea, you have to understand this, that I think that was probably the most dangerous moment since the end of the Cold War that we experienced, because if Russia lost the Crimea forever, it would completely lose the entire access to the sea, more or less, the Black Sea, and would never, ever be able to stand as a power again. And I think that was that moment where Russia actually was willing to play chicken. We're going to do this. We've got the referendum. If you end the world, so be it, because Russia would rather be nothing than not be great. It's very, very important to the Russian psyche to have meaning. And in fact, this sort of the Chinese, I believe they called the 1 century where they were mostly occupied by Westerners as the era of humiliation or something, the century of humiliation, I don't remember. But Russia has very much has been living in that, and is to some degree living in that condition. And I think spiritually it's trying to sort of escape that. Yes.
Okay, Mr. Kirby, thank you so much for taking time and sharing your insight on this. Coming back to you, Mr. George, there's also this conversation we are having in terms of these alliances playing that kind of role, irrespective of the give and take, which is obviously a part of this relationship. But if we reflect on just in the Middle East here, between US and Iran crisis, the alliances have almost helped exacerbate what could have been a highly manageable situation, especially what we're seeing from the UK, ready to be part of the naval patrol in the Strait of Hormuz. What's your opinion on this?
Well, it's possible that it's exacerbated, but only in the sense that there is opposition available to what the US is trying to do. If Iran hadn't been able to call on assistance from Russia and from China, then Iran would have had to succumb to U.S. pressure. The United States is exerting this policy of maximum pressure, and it hit Iran very hard. But imagine how bad off Iran could have been had China, say, refused to purchase its oil. I mean, this has made a big difference. Now, of course, Iran is still suffering terribly under the U.S. policy, but nonetheless, it is able to call upon allies, including Russia and China, to help out in terms of in this crisis. The same is happening in Venezuela. I mean, again, Venezuela is in terrible straits due to the U.S. sanctions, but it is able to look to others to help out. And again, we could say the same as Syria. Syria could have just been wiped out. I mean, it would have been wiped out about 3-4 years ago. Russia was able to come in, stabilize the situation. So you could say that, it's exacerbating, but, the alliances are enabling smaller countries to survive the pressure from the hegemon.
Okay. Here I'd like to welcome another into this conversation, a political analyst joining us from Perth, Dr. Ian Cook. Dr. Cook, talking about how negotiations, especially in alliances, might go awry. For example, if we are to look at the most recent example between Pakistan and India, the bilateral sort of negotiation has pretty much gone to zero. It doesn't work anymore. The problem-solving process has failed. In such a scenario, they look to usually countries, to their bigger allies, to take a step in to sort out something. Do you see something unfolding here in terms of Indian-occupied Kashmir, where there's a complete lockdown? There's absolutely no access of information from what is happening on the ground to people there, with the US or other Western powers stepping in?
I mean, it's a difficult question, that one. I mean, part of the problem is trying to resolve this conflict and work out what rights and where borders should be is quite a difficult one. And while one's allies are supportive of you, they don't always want to get involved in almost impossible problems. And there are times when the Kashmiri problem looks a very difficult one, and the getting involved as another country is something that you might be hesitant toward if you can't see a clear solution, if you can't see some way forward. And I think there are questions here about how we go forward in terms of India-Pakistan relations and how we resolve the tensions. And and I think that's part of the reason why some countries perhaps are holding back from involvement, because, as I say, it's a very difficult situation to see its resolution for.
And when it comes to the US trying to resolve conflicts, they've got the strongest weapon, considering their economy. Their GDP right now almost is equal to, if not more, to that of entire Europe, are economic sanctions. But they choose them only in circumstances where their incentive prioritizes or their interest prioritizes anybody else. There's clearly a major fault in this kind of a relationship, isn't it?
Oh, certainly. And I think that we need to be somewhat careful about sort of diplomatic relations and alliances. I mean, they're driven by self-interest. And so to some extent, they're always vulnerable to these problems that a particular country at a certain moment might decide that, well, whilst in general we're allies and in general we're sympathetic to you, in this particular moment it's not in our interest to act. And so that underlying the reality of the self-interest that underpins the relationship in the first place then comes back and informs decision-making because, as I say, they're sort of sympathetic, but ultimately it's not in our interest to get involved. And Australia does this quite regularly. There are times, we're sympathetic, we look on, it's not in our interest to provoke anything, so we step back.
Mr. George, then let me ask you this. You think that maybe it is this Trump administration which has taken on this whole ultra-nationalist, almost extreme right-wing sort of America First dialogue that has changed the dynamics of how U.S. foreign policy and alliances work out, and as a result creating a lot of distrust with their partners because of President Trump's rather, spontaneous change of heart?
I don't think the Trump administration has made such a substantial difference. There is a difference of style. It's much more a matter of going its own way and just not bothering to consult its allies who are, not so much allies, but actually vassals. But Trump just makes explicit what has always been implicit for many years, which is that its NATO partners, which is pretty much the rest of Europe, just does as it's told. I mean, it's if the United States decrees something, then that's it. That becomes NATO policy, and NATO just doesn't get a look in. So Trump walks out on the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty, something that should affect Europeans very, very profoundly, because it means that in a few years, the U.S. might well be deploying intermediate range missiles on the European continent, and we don't hear a peep out of Europe. I mean, Europe just says, okay, well, you walk out, you walk out. So Trump just makes explicit, says, I am the boss. What I say goes. And the allies just go along with it. And this has been true for quite a long time. I mean, we can go through, even during the Iraq War, when there was some opposition to the United States, the United States prevailed. What happened to France and Germany that opposed the Iraq invasion? They fell into line within a few months.
So you're saying essentially what President Trump is doing or saying is essentially being explicit about what was always implicitly being done by the U.S. Sort of take on foreign policy. Here I'd like to introduce another guest who is joining from Istanbul. He's a former Turkish politician and member of the Turkish parliament. Mr. Egemen Bagis, thank you for joining us, taking out the time. We're essentially talking about whether conflict resolution can be resolved with the help of alliances in the current circumstances. We've got a lot of examples playing out right in front of us. In your opinion, has the sort of era gone past what was first relied on, incentives or selling stability or having a security concern or control over oil? Are countries becoming ultra-nationalist and looking out for their own, unable to rely on their bigger partners?
Well, every country has to prioritize their national interests, but sometimes building alliances makes these national interests achievable, because there are goals that countries cannot achieve on their own, and they need cooperation. But we are living in such an era that alliances are not Catholic marriage. You can have an alliance with one country on one issue and a different alliance with another country on a totally different issue. So the countries do not own each other, and the alliances doesn't mean that they are committed to each other on every front or every issue. And Turkey, the country that I represent, is a great example. We are one of the most important members of NATO, but one of our very important trading partners is Russia, another one is China, and we have good relations with both India and Pakistan. Yes, on different issues, we have different cooperation, different alliances, but also our national interest requires us to have this flexibility, because we are the most eastern part of the West and the most western part of the East. And we serve as a bridge sometimes in different alliances, not only countries.
Do you think that Turkey has essentially protected itself? It's one of the examples I could think of is from the sort of wrath of economic sanctions that it faced from the U.S. under their countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act for them buying the S-400s from Russia.
I'm not saying this. The President of the United States is saying this, that Turkey does not deserve to be sanctioned, because yes, we have purchased S-400 from Russia. In a way, we were forced to, because our typical allies in NATO, especially U.S., would not provide us the air safety equipment like the Patriot, and we needed to protect our citizens. We are living in a very awkward and challengeable part of the world. We don't have the neighbors of Switzerland. Our neighbors are Iran, Iraq, Syria, Georgia, Russia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania. I mean, we are living in a very tense part of the world, so we need to protect ourselves.
Right.
And if we cannot get what you need from your historical ally, then you shop around and try to find what you need from other markets. And that's what we did. So this doesn't call for a sanction. So if the
okay. All right.
US House...
Mr. Bagis, thank you so much for taking out the time speaking to us. Very quickly, we're running out of time here. Dr. Cook, I want to get your insight also again on South Asia, the role China has to play when it comes to conflict resolution. Like Mr. Bagis was of the opinion, this is not a Catholic marriage. I mean, alliances obviously make or break, but they have long-term effect, and especially in regions that are so volatile. What we're seeing right now in Indian-occupied Kashmir, there is a sort of large round of condemnation and points of concern being issued by various world leaders. But do you see something like this being resolved with just these words alone, or do you think countries can and will take a position of authority against what they see as India doing, violating rights and freedom?
I think many countries be very careful with respect to how they approach India, given its sort of growing significance. As we were just discussing, I mean, clearly it's not quite the US, but the Indians have quite a bit of international geopolitical power that means that other countries are somewhat reluctant to intervene in these sorts of circumstances. So, now establishing that there is in fact wrongdoing in Indian-controlled Kashmir, and that international intervention ought to be conducted. I mean, many countries may well agree with that, but as I say, once they look at the possibility of having to take India on and developing poor relations with India, and that's very much a similar situation with China. Most of the other countries in the region are very concerned about their relationship with China, not wanting to damage that relationship because of its economic power. So, everyone's being very, very careful when conflicts arise, and Chinese involvement is something that's going to be looked at, in quite different ways because of concerns about its rising power, but also recognition of its significance.
Thank you, Doctor. They're joining us from Perth. And Mr. George Szamuely, just quickly coming to you for a closing comment on the overall conversation that we are having, how alliances today, international relations can improve on the basis of alliances, or is this concept maturing into a more sort of reflecting in towards their own abilities, an ultra-nationalist concept?
Well, alliances are, they work as long as the allies have a respect for one another's position. At the moment, the problem that it's having is that the global hegemon, the leading power in the world, the United States, is unable to practice diplomacy for the simple reason that it refuses to accept that other powers, rival powers, competitors, whatever you call them, have their own interests. And that if you want to have working relationships with other powers, you're going to have to sacrifice something. You're going to have to give up something of yourself, and they will give up something of theirs. But to walk into every negotiation and say, you will do this, 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 and this, while we're not going to do anything, that just isn't going to go anywhere. And that is why, time and again, all we're getting are these somewhat pointless confrontations. The one aspect I would say, just to go back to the India-Kashmir example, is that unlike the Cold War, I mean, at the moment, there really doesn't seem to be that kind of competition for India and Pakistan as there was during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. So there may be room for some kind of a resolution on this problem. Because it wasn't as it used to be, where United States would back Pakistan, USSR would back India, and so on. But so now, there is at least, the great powers haven't yet taken sides.
There's hope that this conflict could be resolved since the dynamics have changed internationally. Well, thank you so much, Mr. George Szamuely, for joining us here on Newswire. That's all the time we have for this show. We'll be seeing you again. Till then, goodbye.